I open this little parenthesis and then we turn back to our business. 14 years ago, I had, for 2 or 3 years, I had a regular radio, 3 minutes on the important historical events. I could pick them. It was on Radio Luxembourg, and so I did it. It was a weekly a weekly radio talk. And so I remember I picked Dresden. That was on the 14th of February. It must have been 94 or 95. And I of course would not now violently attack the British or the Americans, but I tried to explain why the British and why the United States reacted this way, and I called nonetheless the bombing that it was senseless and that it was a real terror bombing, because those who died, they were civilians. They were civilians, and look what a fuss we make now when by mistake artillery or a drone hits a civilian target in Afghanistan, and if 10 people die, which is of course a tragedy, but then the whole thing is made up and it's called unfortunate. Civilians should not die. This way, in Dresden and in Würzburg, there were no military targets there. This was intentionally the bombing of the civilian side, and so I dared to call it a terror bombing. I got violent answers in the Luxembourgish press how I could dare to call this a terror bombing, but it was. So in other words, you are aware that even now, so long afterwards, that in purely objective terms, history has not yet fully gained its place. Which I would like to insist that I do not make any kind of comparison on the same footing if mistakes and even if actions were done on the Allied side which were ultimately, which caused the deaths of tens of thousands of people, that this is not to be equated with what the Germans did, long planned and in their behavior. But nonetheless, one has to remain critical also of one's own side, and that is sometimes which we keep forgetting. This being said, in terms of military operations, we spoke about the first period from September 1939 until the end of 1941. The time period which was the European stage before it became the world stage. And the time period also when Hitler had the initiative and when Hitler was systematically applying the strategy of the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, from the attack against Poland to the Scandinavian campaign in 1940, then the Western campaign against France and the Benelux countries, then afterwards the Battle of England, which ended up with a setback for the Germans, even though it was not a classical setback in terms of Blitzkrieg strategy, but they failed because the Royal Air Force was tougher than they had imagined. And then in 1941, the Balkan campaign. I just want to warn you a purely technical matter. Baltic and Balkan. Baltic are the three, it's the Baltic Sea, and the three countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which lay south of Finland and north of Poland. That's Baltic. Balkan, that's on the other side. Sometimes there are confusions among students. Balkan, that is Greece, Albania, Yugoslavia, Hungary to a lesser degree, but certainly Bulgaria, and to a minor degree Romania. That is this southern tip of Europe and even parts of Turkey. So the Balkan campaign. And then ultimately did begin and I would rather like to get a solid, clear start with Operation Barbarossa, that is the attack against the Soviet Union. I do remember that we saw the origins. We have seen that. Why did Hitler attack the Soviet Union? But it was the same kind of a major goal which he also had when bringing the Jewish population to the death camps. That is the conquest of living space. That was a key idea in his foreign policy. And that he only got to this point after 2 years of war, because he did not originally mean that there would be a war against Poland, but it was because the Poles resisted, and then that he would have to fight the West. So in other words, he had to make a number of detours, and so in June 1941, he thought that the moment had come, even though Great Britain was still fighting, but he considered that the British were finished off. And by the way, the fighting did not only take place over England, it was not just a battle, it was not just the Battle of England, but there was a similar battle in the Mediterranean, the Battle of Malta, because they also wanted very badly, the Italians and the Germans, to occupy the island of Malta. They were not more successful as far as Malta was concerned as for England. So, Stalin had been warned that there was that the attack was imminent, but he turned down all the warnings. It's still, we saw that his spy organizations in Germany, in Japan, and the warnings from the British and the US, he was nearly blind or deaf. So the attack came as a surprise attack, and that this meant that originally it looked as if this would end up like all the other lightning wars which Hitler had fought. But then, and I explained to you that the Germans, who had not totally mobilized, in other words, they had not yet mobilized their full potential, but they had, I would say, organized their attack on three major targets: Army Group A, North; Army Group B, Center; Army Group C, South. The commanding generals are not that important on the northern, for those of you who are specialists or who are interested in military history. It was General Leeb, L-E-E-B, who commanded Army Group North. It was General Bock, B-O-C-K, Army Group Center, and it was General Rundstedt, the same one, by the way, who commanded the German army during the Battle of the Bulge in 1944-45, here on the Western Front. That was Army Group C. So they had, each group had a specific target. A had as target Leningrad, the old historical capital, and also the center, the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution. B had as target Moscow, and C had as target Ukraine, which was at the same time the breadbasket and also the industrial heart of European Russia. Now, so far we had seen that. The original, the early days and weeks seem to correspond to the expectations of Hitler, because they applied the Blitzkrieg strategy. They used the Air Force to bomb the rears and the supply lines, and they were able, because it was surprise attacks, Stalin did not look as if he was prepared. The Germans destroyed the Red Air Force on the ground. More than 1,000 planes were destroyed before they could even take off. And the armored divisions broke through the Russian lines, went deep inside, turned around, the infantry was following, and so they captured hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers through these operations. Because Stalin had first, he had sacked most of his able generals in the purges of the Red Army, so the Russian generals in their majority were not the top men, and he had advanced his troops too far, not in an in-depth, let's say, organization, but most of the Red Army was too close to the German lines, so that the Germans could capture in the first weeks and months hundreds of thousands, nearly 2 million Red Army troops. But now we get to the other part of the medal. But Hitler had underestimated, nonetheless, first the distances. The distances were now in the east, when in the west you would move 10 kilometers, this meant 100 kilometers. In other words, the distances played against, they were much bigger. The Germans could not use neither the railroads nor the roads. The roads were in a poor shape, and the railroads had wider tracks so that the Germans could not use them. So in other words, in terms of communication, transportation, and advance, they were at a handicap. Then the Russian soldiers fought with fierce determination, so that the German casualties, despite of their victories, were very high from the first day on. There was practically no day where they did not have something like 1,000 casualties, killed or wounded. And ultimately, they did not have enough armored divisions to advance at the same time on 3 fronts and carry out their blitzkrieg strategy in a successful way. They had to switch armored divisions from one front to the next and then bring them back. So in other words, they had not done this in-depth preparation which the generals claimed Hitler were necessary for the operations. And then ultimately there was one more, there were several other setbacks. One was they had attacked relatively late. The original date for the attack had been the 15th of May. But because of the Balkan campaign, they had to delay it till the 22nd of June. That is 5 more weeks, even more. And so these 5 more weeks, they did not have them during the good season. In other words, winter would come earlier. And this time they had not reckoned the winter came even without this being late, came even much earlier, in September. And they did not have winter equipment. Hitler was so sure that he would knock out the Red Army that his own army did not have winter equipment, neither for the soldiers in terms of uniforms, warm clothes, nor in terms of material equipment for the motorized divisions and for the armored divisions. If you know perfectly well, in a normal winter, in our days, when you have a car outside and when the temperature drops under, let's say, -10 or -20, that the motor will not turn on, or even worse. And so most of the motorized equipment did not work, and the Germans will have as heavy casualties as a consequence of the cold as of enemy action. And then there was one last thing which also was Hitler's fault. He still had this deep-seated racialist and anti-Semitic attitude, because we have mentioned that last time also, behind the armored units, the SS had set up 4 commando groups. Originally, these commando groups were about 1,000, between 800 and 1,000 SS individuals, who were supposed to round up and shoot the Jewish population behind the line. Now, originally, that also gives you an idea that they did not carefully, even in terms of mass murder, plan everything. Originally, they meant to kill the male Jewish population. But then, after having done this for nearly a month, they found out what would they do with women and children. Then they decided that they would kill all of them. But this meant that they had to reinforce, so they set up tenfold these killer units behind the lines, which created problems then for the members of the units, and also was for the German generals and the German army. So in other words, I do not want to develop this at length, but this ultimately convinced Himmler and Hitler that they had to find another means to dispose of the Jewish population. Nonetheless, despite the fact that that's when they decided that they had to build up death factories, that is, extermination camps, the 6 which they will ultimately open up in Poland the year following, that is in 42. Not right away, but from the middle of 42 on, of which Auschwitz was one. But nonetheless, they killed 1 million Jewish people during the first 6 months, that is from June till December 1941. But if the Jews were the main victims from the beginning on, they treated very badly also the Russian population, because they considered the Russians as being crypto-Bolsheviks, as being an inferior race. So, and that was a grievous mistake, because the population in the Baltic countries, in White Russia, even in the Ukraine, which had suffered a lot under Stalin's terror, under his forced industrialization and collectivization. The Germans were originally, in many places, greeted like liberators. In other words, they were welcome. But when then they turned around, they treated this population as if they were the last human scum, killing and using reprisals if ever a German soldier was killed, then the local population turned against them. Because when they had to choose between 2 evils, Stalin, who did not now, for racialist reason, intend to kill them, but who killed them because of the ruthlessness, of the brutality of his industrialization and collectivization purpose. But at least they had a faint chance to get away. But the Germans treated them fundamentally as minor human beings, as subhumans, and they made no secret out of it that they were supposed to be the future slaves. They turned against them. And they then helped the partisan movement, and they did actions of sabotage, and the Germans had to reinforce their rear divisions to keep control over the areas through which the German army had already advanced. So in other words, Hitler's racialist attitudes fundamentally made him lose quite quickly the sympathies of the population, which originally had greeted the Germans as liberators. And then ultimately, Hitler had misjudged the potential of the Soviet Union, the human and the technological, the industrial and military potential, against the warnings of his of Admiral Canaris. Canaris was the military counterpart of Heydrich, the military intelligence. He was an admiral, and Canaris had reports about the real potential of the Soviet army, that they had evacuated quite a few factories before the advancing Germans into the Urals and into Siberia. They had other factories in Siberia which were totally out of reach for the German bombers, which produced guns, which produced tanks. Hitler simply discarded reports. He said that was nonsense. He did not take them seriously. And ultimately, Stalin got now definite reports that the Japanese would not attack in the Far East. He had kept something like 30, maybe 40 divisions in the Far East, ready to counter the Japanese if they attacked from let's say, from Outer Mongolia on. But this time he believed his spy in Tokyo, Richard Zorgi, who had found out that inside the Japanese high command, the admirals had prevailed against the generals, because there were two parties or two groups inside the high command of the Japanese. The generals who wanted to conquer not only China but also to attack the Soviet Union, and the admirals who tried to expand into the south and into the Pacific and who were willing to take up the United States. So the decision had been taken in Tokyo that the admirals would have the last word. So in other words, Stalin knew that he did not have to keep this division in the Far East, and he brought them back to Europe. He brought them back for the defense of Moscow. This was something Hitler did not know, and he put in charge of the defense of Moscow a young general who had survived his purges. And this general's name, he was the equivalent of Patton and MacArthur at the same time, General Zhukov. Zhukov, Z-H-U-K-O-V, Zhukov. You have different ways of writing it. Is Russian. Zhukov. He was the ablest general. Zhukov was put in command of the defense of Moscow, and he got these fresh troops. And these soldiers were very often of Asian background. They were sturdy, tough fighters, and they had the best equipment, also winter equipment. And so while Hitler was practically exhausting his forces on the three fronts, north, center, and south, and particularly at the center, Zhukov was building up the defense of Moscow, having these crack divisions north, south, and east of Moscow, waiting for the Germans to approach. And so, ultimately, by December 1941, the Germans had surrounded the city of Leningrad, but they had not captured Leningrad, and they will not capture Leningrad. They will keep not a full siege, because there was still one space open through which the Russians could bring in supply. They did not have huge supply, but nonetheless, Leningrad was not totally isolated and was never captured. One of your journalist historian, Salisbury, has written 20 years ago, now new books have come out, but Salisbury's book was famous, the 900 days. The siege of Leningrad lasted 900 days, and during these 900 days it is estimated that 2 million people died from hunger, essentially. But still they produced guns, they produced tanks in their ammunition factories, and so they even produced one of their a special concert during the siege of Leningrad. I forgot whether it was Prokofiev or Shostakovich who the Germans could not believe their ears when they all of a sudden heard on their listening devices that the Russians were in the middle of the siege when the battle was still going on. It was a sign of determination not to give up. So in other words, Leningrad was not captured, but was surrounded. On the southern front, the Germans had advanced and had occupied most of the territory. The Russians will ultimately fight back, but nonetheless, the target was to a great degree reached in the south. But at the center, that is direction Moscow, the German advance had not been conclusive. Simply, because first of all the terrain was difficult. It is a forest area. It's a Russian taiga, and also hilly. So in other words, in the south it was flat, and so it was easy for the German armored divisions to advance, but in the center that was not the case. So in other words, they were late, and they did not have, they ultimately concentrated whatever armored divisions they had, and so they advanced slowly, step by step, coming close to Moscow. Zhukov now, the general in command of the defense of the city. By the way, Stalin remained behind in Moscow. He did not leave the capital city, but he had evacuated nonetheless the government, the administration on the Volga, just in case. But he remained in Moscow. And Zhukov's orders were that he would not throw into the fighting his reserve divisions which he had posted around Moscow. They waited for the Germans to approach. They mobilized whatever troops they had in defense of Moscow stationed before Moscow, and even workers were mobilized. And so the Germans step by step came close. By the 5th of December, they had reached a place where they could see the Kremlin and the anti-air force guns of the Kremlin, who were shooting at the German airplanes. But then, when they certainly did not expect it, when they were exhausted and they suffered casualties from the winter, then Zhukov gave the order to counterattack. And this counterattack came totally by surprise, with massive superior forces. This counterattack was so strong on the night from the 5th to the 6th of December that the German generals implored Hitler to allow them to pull back over a distance of 500 kilometers because they were afraid that they would be totally crushed. Hitler sacked the commanding generals and gave the order to hold out by all means, not to withdraw. But despite of this order, the Russians were able to push the Germans back over a distance of 100 kilometers west of Moscow, where ultimately the front was again stabilized. So in other words, the Germans did not capture Moscow, the Russians counterattacked and threw the Germans back. This was very clearly a great victory for the Russians. But it was not only a great victory in military terms. It meant that the Blitzkrieg strategy had failed. Remember, the Blitzkrieg strategy had one weak point. There was no alternative. If it failed, this meant that the war was lost, because there were no sufficient reserves to be mobilized in order to make a second attempt. And that is exactly the situation in which the Germans found themselves. The Battle of Moscow was the proof that the Blitzkrieg strategy in Russia had failed. And so that now the Russians would build up their momentum, and they had reserves, they had a potential. The Germans now desperately tried to find resources to mobilize other resources, military and industrial and human. And the one whom Hitler will put in charge in 1942 of mobilizing this will be Albert Speer. But it meant that this was, and most German generals understood that the war was lost. Nonetheless, Hitler's grip over his generals, he sacked the commanding general and did take over himself as nearly chief of staff of the armed forces, the command of the German army. You must imagine Hitler, who was a corporal of World War I, who had no military training. He now did take over as chief of staff the military operations from that moment on. And from that moment on, he disappeared practically in his bunker, that is in his command post, and he will practically not go back to Berlin, or he spent now the rest of the war in this command post, where ultimately, as you know, on July the 20th, an assassination attempt will be staged against him. He would not make public speeches any longer. That was left to Goebbels. He now was the warlord, trying to win the war, which he could not win. But that was not all. Just one day after the Battle of Moscow had revealed Russian strength and German weakness, on December 7th, the Japanese attacked in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor. In other words, now the United States got involved into the war through this Japanese initiative. But Pearl Harbor, in a sense, you should know that was not the first time that the Japanese attacked by surprise without war declaration. It is the best known. But they had already done the same in 1904, when they had attacked the Russian Tsarist Pearl Harbor on the Chinese coast, Port Arthur. That was the Japanese major naval bases, in the Russian major naval bases on the Chinese coast. The Japanese attacked by surprise and did sink the Russian Pacific fleet. They did the same, or nearly, for Pearl Harbor. But their problem, and the American luck, was that the aircraft carriers were not in. They were out. So the aircraft carriers were not sunk in Pearl Harbor, but the big battleships, they went down. Next is the United States on December 8th declared war on Japan. Hitler was not bound because the Japanese had not declared war on the Soviet Union. The Japanese remained, as far as the Soviet Union was concerned, neutral. But Hitler considered that the same as he had judged that England was defeated, despite the fact that he had lost the Battle of England, the same did he judge that the Soviet Union would be finished off soon. So Hitler, 3 days later, on December 11th, declared war on the United States as a kind of solidarity with Japan. He was not forced to, and Mussolini did the same. But this, of course, after the Battle of Moscow, this changed the military and political situation totally, because barely had Hitler done this, that Winston Churchill, who had already met the American President Roosevelt in August, not in the United States, but on a warship off the coast of the US, to discuss of what might happen. But the United States were still neutral at the time. Now, with Hitler's war declaration, the United States got into the war. The United States got into World War II not by their own decision, but essentially by the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor and by Hitler's war declaration on December 11th. So in other words, now the US found themselves on two sides in a war situation. And what was the most amazing is that even though from 1940 on, the American, let's say, ammunition industries were slowly moving up to produce, not for their own sake, but for the British, because despite the fact of their neutrality, the United States were sending supply to Great Britain, the same as Stalin had sent supply to Hitler before Hitler attacked him. Now, but nonetheless, in general terms, the US were totally unprepared for this kind of war situation. But that is the most amazing thing. The gigantic war industries, or the war industry machine, was turned on now on a vast scale, in terms of shipbuilding, in terms of air force, in terms of building up an army. It will take, of course, time before this will yield results, but it was incredible in such a short time, from late 1941 on until early 1944, the American war machine was ready to go and was even supplying all the other participants in the war, the British and even to some degree the Red Army and other forces, to fight the aggressors, to fight Hitler and to fight the Japanese. So in other words, Churchill flew to Washington. This time they were both in the same boat. Now, Hitler was the man, to some degree, who made now the so-called Grand Alliance a reality. The United States the British did not pick Stalin as their ally, and the US did not pick Stalin as their ally against Hitler. It was Hitler who did it, following the well-known proverb that the enemy of your enemy is your friend, is your partner. So between the United States and the Soviet Union, no formal alliance was signed. Such a formal alliance was signed between the British and the Soviet Union after the German attack in June 1941, but none on the US side. But Churchill convinced Roosevelt to give first priority in the United States war effort to the European stage. So in other words, that the American army would get as their field of operation Europe. The war in the Pacific was left to the Navy and to the Marines and to the Naval Air Force, to the aircraft carriers, in other words. So in other words, for the Pacific stage, two men were put in charge. Admiral Nimitz for the Navy and Douglas MacArthur for the American Army. And what Douglas MacArthur did was to get out of the Philippines, which were surrounded, and unfortunately he got out of it, but the American soldiers stationed there got into Japanese prison camps with all the consequences this meant. But Douglas MacArthur, nonetheless, when he left the Philippines, he made the famous statement that he would come back and liberate the Philippines. So these are the two American outstanding military figures, Nimitz and MacArthur, in the Pacific. On the European stage, ultimately Eisenhower was put in charge later on. But the man who was behind the stage organizing the American war effort was General Marshall, who was head of the Chiefs of Staff, and he will build up the American war effort in direction Europe. Nonetheless, if we draw now the conclusion, at the end of 1941, the war changed totally in dimension and in outlook. From late 1941, Hitler's war became World War II. It became a world war because there will be an Asian stage and there will be a European stage. And the country which was bearing the brunt on both sides were the United States. The British were also there, and the British did their best, but of course the British had limited means. But the fact is nonetheless that the British are the European country which fought the most bravely at a moment when everything seemed to be lost. But now, of course, Churchill was right that he had expected that sooner or later the US would come in. They were in now by late 1941. So we get into the second stage of the war, of Hitler's war, from late 41 until early 43. That is essentially the crucial year 1942. From that moment on, the real potential, that is the means which the countries at war could really mobilize, came into play. And here, of course, the Germans, despite of Speer, and the Japanese were at a loss, because the United States and the Soviet Union did by far outclass, in terms of the Soviet Union only concentrating on Hitler and the United States on both. They had other means and a greater potential. And here again, Hitler became victim of his own racialist prejudices. Hitler never had a true, I would say, objective appreciation of real American power. He despised the American people, and he despised Roosevelt. He despised the American people because for Hitler, the melting pot reality was the proof that the United States could not, the Americans could not be a valuable, in Nazi terms, race because of this mixture. He felt that that was incredible. He had even a poor opinion then about the Slavs and what have you. And he also misjudged Roosevelt. So in that sense, he was totally beside the point. But because he would never, nobody knows, it's one of those iffy questions. And if Hitler had not declared war on the United States on the 11th of December 1941, would the United States have declared war on Hitler? I personally believe that they would have concentrated on the Japanese, and then afterwards only turn around and give then second priority. But because they were at war with somebody, and they would not by themselves have added a second war declaration against Hitler had Hitler not attacked, had Hitler not declared war on the United States. There were even, although those plans never came close to a beginning of an implementation, there were German war plans about gigantic naval forces to invade the United States. But of course this was just nonsense. It never came close, but they were still in the drawer. If the war had successfully ended in Europe, what Hitler would have done then afterwards. But anyway, 1942. 1942 in military terms. We'll later on have a look on the political situation. In 1942, let's go back to the European stage, because the United States were in no position to participate actively in the war effort. They were building up their forces throughout 1942 and even to some degree throughout 1943. So Hitler in the spring of, during the winter of 1942, the Eastern Front remained not only in physical terms, in military terms, frozen. No operations during the winter. And Stalin did not take the initiative. Hitler was the one he was forced now to make a second attempt to conquer the living space, that is, to defeat the Soviet Union. Nonetheless, it became evident that he did not have the means to launch on three fronts offensives. So in other words, the limitations the Germans had, despite of the efforts they now made to mobilize, were such that the Army Front A and B remained passive. In other words, the Germans remained on the defensive on their northern front and on their central front. They attacked on their southern front, which was in a sense logical, because on the southern front they could use their armored divisions. But it was in the spring of 1942 only that they resumed their offensive on the south. Stalin was slow in learning the lessons, because he still kept in command on the southern front some of the generals whom he trusted for political reasons, but which had not been, let's say, up to the challenge. So in other words, the Russian commanders on the southern fronts at that time were still not up to the challenge. So the Germans broke through and again captured hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers. They advanced eastwards again. If you look on the map, we don't have one, but you must have a mental map before your eye. They had crossed the Dnieper. They arrived now on the Don. The Don is the other river which empties into the Black Sea. And the Don makes a curve where the Germans arrived. That Rostov on the Don is the city. So the Germans crossed the Don, and they had then to make a decision, or Hitler made a decision. And that was a fateful decision. He decided to split up the southern group, to split up this group in two. One part of the army south, an infantry army, was sent in direction of the Volga with the target Stalingrad, the city on the Volga, which was an industrial city. It had 500,000 inhabitants, and it controlled, of course, the traffic on the Volga. And Hitler picked this not only for strategic reasons, but also because it had the name of Stalin. But it was a fateful decision, because he sent an infantry army, the 6th Army, under General Paulus, Paulus, direction Stalingrad. And he sent an armored army, that is, an army essentially made up by armored divisions, to the south to capture the oil fields, into the area of Baku and the Caucasian Mountains. So to send armored divisions into the mountains and infantry divisions on the flatland was absolutely nonsense. Nonetheless, what happened now was Stalin knew what Hitler was doing, because he still had his intelligence organization telling him what the German war plans were. So he knew perfectly well that Hitler was aiming at conquering Stalingrad. Because if he would conquer Stalingrad, not only would this be a prestige victory, but he could cut then the Russian supply line, essentially energy supply, coal and oil, and also food supply, which was moving up the Volga and which was vital for the supply of Moscow and of Leningrad. So if he was able to cut this, then the Russians would get into deep trouble. And so he put in charge of the defense of Stalingrad the same man he had put in charge of the defense of Moscow, Zhukov. And Zhukov was repeating the same strategy. Zhukov was withdrawing from the other fronts major forces, which he was setting up north, south, and behind Stalingrad, and giving the order to the Russian army in front of Stalingrad, defending against the approaching Germans, to fight with all their means. They would even arm the factory workers of Stalingrad to fight the Germans. And so the fighting started for good over Stalingrad from September on. It was a fierce resistance, and the Germans had to fight street by street, house by house. Ultimately, from October on, when the Germans were totally exhausted, came the Russian counterblow. This time, they did not only kick the Germans back, but this time the Russians wanted more, because the Germans used, for the conquest of Stalingrad, they used their auxiliary troops, that is, the troops which were given to them by their European allies, Hungarian, Romanian, and to some degree Bulgarian, but Hungarian, Romanian, and Spanish. There was one Spanish division, legion there. So in other words, they used allied soldiers, and these allied soldiers, Hungarians and Romanians, they did not have the morale. Particularly in October, it was a Russian winter, and they were thousands of miles away from home. So in other words, these troops were relatively demoralized. When the Russian counterattack came now, the Russians had a superiority of 5 to 1 in comparison to the German opposing forces. They did, without difficulties, break north and south through the German lines, that is, through the Romanian and Hungarian forces, and surrounded them, encircled the besieging German army which was besieging Stalingrad. So 3 days after the beginning of the attack, the Russians closed the circle. And the German general, Paulus, called on Hitler to be allowed to pull out of Stalingrad. And of course, again, Hitler gave the order under no circumstances that they had to hold out and that he would send in armored divisions to break up the circle. These armored divisions were to be commanded by General Manstein, Manstein. It's the same Manstein who had devised already the German strategy in the attack against France. And the battle will continue. There was the battle going on all the time, but the fighting will continue until late January 1943. Even the last German forces would surrender even in early February. Now, what happened was General Manstein was unable to break up the circle, so the Russians were holding tight. But meanwhile, the other armored army, which Hitler had sent against the oil fields into the Caucasian mountains, the commanding general by the name of Kleist, K-L-E-I-S-T, Kleist immediately, when he got news about what was happening in Stalingrad, he became aware of the danger of being cut off from any kind of withdrawal possibility. So he gave the order to his armored divisions to turn around and hurry back to Rostov-on-the-Don to be able to cross the Don River so that the Russians would not cut him from his from the possibility of falling back. Hitler was so furious that he ordered Kleist to hold on, the same as Paulus, but Kleist disobeyed. The German armored divisions were brought back. Nonetheless, altogether, in late 1942, this meant that now was on the Eastern Front the turning of the tide. The Germans saved their armored divisions, Kleist did, but Stalingrad ultimately got into a desperate situation so that Paulus requested from Hitler that he should be allowed to surrender. Hitler refused. He appointed him a field marshal, hoping that this would prevent him from surrendering. He expected even that Paulus would commit suicide, but Paulus did not. Paulus ultimately surrendered in January 1943. From the 300,000 soldiers, about 70,000 only remained and went into Russian captivity. The others either had died or had been evacuated when the fighting was going on. The German Air Force was evacuating the wounded. So in other words, Stalingrad fell. And this was a symbol. Stalingrad was in World War II what Verdun had been in 1916 in World War I. It was a symbol. It meant that not only the Germans lost the battle, but this time it was clear that the Red Army had the potential to defeat the Germans. It would only be a matter of time. So from that moment on, this was the turning of the tide. The Germans, despite on, we'll see that when we get to the next year, despite on, I would say, occasional attempts to take the initiative back, the Germans were now on the defensive. That was the turning of the tide in the east. This meant they would lose the war. The turning of the tide in Africa came nearly at the same time, September, October. In Africa, the Germans had sent, in order to help their Italian allies, which were in disarray and in bad trouble, against the British army who was kicking them out of Egypt. The British had meanwhile at their head Montgomery. Montgomery was Churchill's favorite. There was a commanding general earlier who had already stopped the Italians and the Germans, that was General Wavell, but Montgomery was given superior forces now, so he was kicking Rommel, the desert fox, back, direction Tunisia. Here the battle, the decisive battle did take place. It was September, October, the Battle of El Alamein. A-L in two words. A-L-A-M-E-I-N. El Alamein, where the Germans were defeated, and from that moment on, the rollback started also in Africa. Meanwhile, this was October, meanwhile, American and British forces had, in order to comply to Stalin, had been landing, not in Europe, but in Northern Africa, in Morocco. November 1942, the first American forces landing on the Western operation ground were those who landed in Morocco. But nonetheless, there was no way. Stalin urged that there should be landing in France, but the United States, of course, who were still in their build-up phase, they did not have the means, and the British did not. So in other words, American forces coming from West Morocco and British forces coming from the east, the Germans then, too late, were sending on reinforcement to Tunisia. But that was, of course, too late. You know, and this is a parenthesis I'm opening, you know that there was now a kind of competition taking place between commanding generals. The British General Montgomery, on the British side, coming from the east, and on the American side, Patton was already on stage. I can only recommend you to see the movie Patton. You know, you have visited probably Patton's grave in Ham.
When did the Americans land in Africa?
No, November 1942. Patton had studied. Patton, he was an exceptional individual. He came from a real family of higher up militaries, and he had studied all major battles by preceding great military commanders from the days of Hannibal on, throughout Napoleon to the present. So in other words, if there was anybody who knew the battleground well, it was Patton. Now, I close this parenthesis. So in Northern Africa, the turning of the tide came there. In the Pacific, the turning of the tide had come much earlier. I purposely focused on the European and the African stage because that is our purpose, because Hitler was involved in that. But in the Far East, in the Pacific, the turning of the tide came already in May, June. The decisive battle did take place in June. That was the Battle of Midway. You know that if a movie was also made on the Battle of Midway, where all American Western heroes participated in the uniforms of admirals. It is an interesting movie. At least it allows you to learn history. Now, what happened? Why were the Japanese defeated? The first defeat did already take place in May 1942. That was the Battle of the Coral Sea, that is to the southeast, on the gates of Australia. in this area, you know, where Indonesia and Australia are close by. Why were the American forces now all of a sudden gaining? For two reasons. One was that the United States counterintelligence had been able to decode the Japanese secret military code. So in other words, the United States knew what the Japanese had in mind, because they would listen in and know what the communications were. So they knew exactly what the Japanese were after. And secondly, the United States were building now aircraft carriers, battleships, destroyers, cruisers, on a scale which the Japanese could in no way rival. And the American aircraft carriers, already operational, had escaped Pearl Harbor. So that Admiral Nimitz was now moving towards Midway, while the Japanese commanders were trying to, because they thought that they would inflict a heavy defeat on the United States Navy at Midway. Midway is practically midway between the Japanese islands and Hawaii. So it was, in strategic terms, it was a very important place, which was in American hands. Now, to make it short, because the United States knew about the Japanese fleet and which aircraft carriers they had, Nimitz was able to hide before the Japanese the presence of his aircraft carriers. And when now the Japanese admiral who commanded the force, when he gave the order to his aircraft carriers to attack Midway, in other words, when they were without defense, when the planes were up, Nimitz gave then the order to attack the Japanese aircraft carriers. So 4 or 5 of major carriers, which were even bigger than the US carriers, were sunk while their planes were off. So in other words, the destruction of the defeat of Midway deprived the Japanese of their main, I would say, attacking force, the aircraft carriers. And from that moment on, from June 1942 on, was the turning of the tide in the Pacific. That is, in the Pacific, the Japanese were now on the losing side. They were now on the defensive. In Russia, Hitler was on the defensive, and also in Africa. So that from the crucial year of the turning of the tide was 42. From June till November, the Axis powers, as they were called, Mussolini did not matter any longer, that is the Japanese and Hitler, now were on a defensive position. It was only a matter of time before they would lose. So we get now to this decisive 2 last years of the war, from 43 till 45. During these 2 years, step by step, the superior forces of the Allies, that is the Red Army on the Eastern Front, and the United States in the Pacific, as well as in Africa and in Southern Europe, plus ultimately in Western Europe, from Normandy on, were pushing the Japanese and Hitler back to the German home ground. Now, what are the important elements? I do not go into details. Nonetheless, what you should know is that the first, if we look on the Eastern Front, the Russians were without any doubt bearing the brunt of the war, because 2/3 of the German army were concentrated on the Eastern Front in Russia. 1/3 was only spread out in the Balkan, in Italy, on the Western Front, and for the time being in Africa. But 2/3 were on the Russian front. Therefore, let's have first a look on what was going on there. The Russians, after Stalingrad, were now practically issuing one offensive after the other. First, the spring offensive, where they moved, they pushed the Germans back towards the Ukraine, and then afterwards there will be a summer offensive, a winter offensive, and so on. The Germans try, and the northern and central front, neither on the German nor on the Russian side, would move. The war operations did take place all on the southern front. I have a question to you, those of you who are already a little bit familiar with the evolution of the war. Why did the Russians attack on the southern front? Why not on the northern? Why not on the central front? They would not abbreviate the siege of Leningrad. In other words, they would not shorten the suffering of the civilian population in Leningrad. Why? Why did they attack on the southern front? Who dares?
Wasn't it because that's where the German army was the strongest? They wanted to wipe them out altogether?
Well, in that case, they would have logically attacked where the German army would have been the weakest.
True.
Was it farther east and they wanted to push the Germans farther east to get them in closer?
That could be, in other words, the Germans had advanced in Russian territory on the southern front much deeper than on the others. That, to some degree, that holds the line. But there is another reason. The other reason is, and this will make a difference when we speak about the political conditions. The other reason is simply Stalin did not only argue and think in military terms. He also thought in political terms, that is, in what would happen after the war, when the military operations would be over. And so he clearly wanted to arrive as fast as possible in the Balkan area. That is, to arrive in Romania and Bulgaria, to come down into an area of Eastern and Southeastern Europe, which had been, for centuries, one of the main, I would say, goals in terms of Russian influence and Russian expansion. So in other words, he already thought of what he might do once his army would move into Romania and Bulgaria. And so in other words, he was for strategic military political considerations. He did not hesitate to sacrifice not only soldiers on the front, but even civilians under siege, as it was the case in Leningrad. Now, the Germans, Hitler thought that he could stop this Russian advance. So Hitler then mounted to what ultimately turned out to be the last great German offensive attempt, an attempt to take back the initiative and beat the Russians. Because so far, the Russians had defeated the Germans, but the Battle of Stalingrad was not a battle where German armored divisions were active. That was the German infantry. So the Germans still felt that they had an edge, a superiority in terms of armored divisions, in terms of tank warfare. And so they decided to prepare a major battle, a major attack on a place where there was a bend in the front. In other words, the front line was not a straight line, but there was a bend where the Russians, there was a bulge where the Russians advanced a little bit more, and that was in the Ukraine, in the area between the Ukraine and southern Russia. The city where ultimately the battle will take place is the city of Kursk, K-U-R-S-K. The Battle of Kursk will take place in July, August 1943. That is the third major battle where Hitler made all his prestige play in order to defeat the Russians and take again the initiative. But this Battle of Kursk will end a little bit the same way as the Battle of Moscow or the Battle of Stalingrad, for two reasons, or for three reasons. First, the Russians knew about the German plans, and so they prepared the counter. Secondly, they put in charge of this front line, it's the same general who had already successfully defeated the Germans before Moscow and before Stalingrad, General Zhukov. And thirdly, the Russians had by that time major armored forces, much bigger forces than the Germans. The Russians produced on a massive scale tanks. The Germans had, during the war, and particularly at that time, they had at least 4 or 5 different models. They had the Panther, they had the Tiger. In other words, they had different models, heavy, middle, small, but they did not produce it on a vast scale. Whereas the Russians produced one tank. They had 2 models, but there was one, which turned out to be the best tank of World War II. That's the T-34. The T-34 tank was a tank which the Russians developed, inspired by German and the American Christie tank. The Russians used their knowledge of what others produced to produce a tank which was fast, which had an excellent armor, and which had also a gun which was superior to in other words, he had all advantages. And they produced this tank thousands and tens of thousands. It will be the tank which they used even after the war in more sophisticated varieties in the 50s and 60s even, when they put down the Hungarian Revolution and later on in Prague. So, when now the Germans attacked, they advanced about half a day into Russian lines, but then the Russians countered on such a massive scale that they did overrun the Germans and defeated the Germans bluntly. Now, this was now the decisive battle. From now on, Stalin's troops, the Israeli army, had proved that they could beat the Germans on the very stage which had been the superiority of the Germans, tank warfare. So from July, August 1943 on, it was only a matter of time before the Red Army would arrive on the frontiers of Germany. Now, Hitler had faced, just before the battle did take place, the Germans had suffered a major setback, because in August, when the battle was already on, Mussolini was overthrown in Italy. And Italy switched sides. In other words, Mussolini was removed from power, and Hitler, in order to keep control over Italy, he had hastily to remove 4 armored SS divisions from the Russian front to Italy in order to control the situation in Italy. So in other words, the SS divisions, which they would have needed very badly during the Battle of Kursk, they had to send them to Italy. But from that moment on, it was only a matter of time. The Russians advanced, and by late 1943, they had practically liberated most of the Ukraine. They came close in early 44 to the frontier of Romania, where they will ultimately penetrate. So that was the situation on the Eastern Front, which was still where the brunt was practically carried by the Russians. Now you should know that Russian generals, unlike American generals, were not regardful of the blood of their soldiers. They would not hesitate to sacrifice divisions, to throw them into the battle, which was absolutely the opposite attitude of American generals, who would weigh the potential of losses and of the likelihood of victory, and they would only attack when they had far superior forces. The Russians had already far superior forces. The US even had even more. Meanwhile now, the situation was evolving in Africa. In February, March 1943, British and American forces arrived in Tunisia and forced the German forces in Tunisia to surrender. So after Stalingrad, the Western Allies captured about 250,000 German forces in Tunisia. And they prepared from that moment on a landing in Sicily. July, landing in Sicily from Northern Africa on. And Sicily was easily conquered. And so from Sicily on, the advance of British and American forces, it was Patton and Montgomery who were moving, side by side. The landing in southern Italy was then prepared and was successfully carried through. At that moment, when the landing in southern Italy occurred, the political coup in Italy came. In other words, Mussolini was then overthrown by his own fascist council and was imprisoned in central Italy in the mountains, where Hitler's SS liberated him ultimately. So Italy switched sides, but nonetheless, the Germans had hastily sent in these SS divisions which were able to move southwards and to stabilize the front for the time being, so that the Italian front now will only slowly move up from south of Naples to Milan. It took them more than 2 years. So it was not the Italian forces in Italy which made the decision in the war. The fighting was going on, and by the way, I do not know whether you got this while we were in Krakow. When we visited one of the churches, there were candles burned because they were burned in memory of the Polish soldiers who fought in one of the battles for a monastery, for the Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino. This Monte Cassino monastery was ultimately captured by the British, but those who fought in the British ranks were Polish officers and Polish soldiers. So, well, let's stop here.